Game 3 of the World Chess Championships saw a lot of drama from the get-go. Let's see what Gukesh brought to the table with his second game with the white pieces. And we'll dive right in. It was 1d4 to begin with, well, showing once again that Gukesh has a lot of different weapons. He's come to the table very, very well prepared. And let's see what he had in store. Ding went for knight f6, keeping his options open, not committing the d-pawn. Potentially from here, there could be the King's Indian, the various Nimzo and Bogo Indian structures, depending on what white plays, even the Grunfeld, and etc., depending on what white plays. There followed knight f3, not committing the c-pawn just yet. After d5, now, having played d5, white struck with c4. And from here, pawn e6, a very sensible move, just connecting the pawn chain. In terms of the main line at this point, definitely knight c3 can happen. Even g3 with the Catalan, where the main line would follow d takes c4, although various other things have been tried. Even the likes of David Howell himself, who's currently commentating, and Vladimir Kramnik, former world champion, have attempted such such openings, where I seem to recall in some lines where essentially black tries to fortify their center, white achieve an eventual e4 push, possibly even e5, reroutes this bishop back to d3, and you can imagine quite an aggressive approach. Nonetheless, Gukesh clearly decided to go a different way in his preparation, and he captured on d5. Instead of all these other structures, he captured on d5, where after the sensible pawn captures, if queen or knight, then if knight, then the e4 pawn will be a problem. If the queen takes, then this knight to c3 will gain time. Either way, you'll be handing white two central pawns versus one. Therefore, e takes d5 was most logical, and after knight to c3, well, this is quite simplified compared to all the main lines where there's a lot of tension on d5. This has clarified things, and as a result, black might well not be unhappy. However, after c6, making a very sensible pawn chain, opening up for the queen somewhere, just a generally sensible move. Queen c2, very specific, controlling the diagonal, stopping bishop f5 free. Not forcing, but a compelling black if they want to achieve such a move to play g6, which possibly, as we may well see later, slightly weakens the dark squares around specifically these two diagonals. The bishop cannot do both. However, given the lack of tension or less tension in the center, very possibly these are a little bit safer as a result, being defended by the queen and the bishop. And of course, this bishop can also only attack one way or the other. In any case, h3 was played, a very curious move, not developing a piece, but setting up against exactly this position with bishop f5, which will gain a tempo, and that's exactly what happened. And then white played queen b3. Now, although they've taken two moves to do this, this bishop on f5 is interesting. It looks like it's gained time. However, of course, the downside is this b7 pawn is under attack. I actually had a recent game myself in a similar structure where after queen b6, both queens tend to look at each other, and neither side, potentially, anyway, neither side wants to capture, especially in the case of white. If queen takes b6, a takes b6, this pawn structure is actually quite solid. It can go forwards to b5, locked down on light squares, and the rook on the a file is very, very powerful, being activated automatically. And black is already a little bit better, if not significantly better. The game could continue. White's not losing, but they're quite considerably worse just from this additional power from this rook. For that reason, Gukesh clearly had come prepared and played g4. And at this moment, Ding had definitely been caught in some preparation. Gukesh had used less than a minute. Ding using in the area of 15 minutes. He now spent quite a while on queen takes b3 in the area of 15 more minutes. And that's because he was debating whether to simply move the bishop, which potentially is a more safe move. For example, bishop e4, using the fact that this diagonal, of course, has been opened. There would follow bishop g2. And this would keep the tension. The queens are still on, not clarifying the structure at all. Also, of course, with this being a problem, potentially d4 is weakened. It would have been an entirely different game. Instead, Ding, at the surprise of a lot of the commentators, went for queen takes b3, a takes b3, and then immediately bishop c2. And it's not that it's a bad move. It makes a lot of sense. It's attacking the b3 pawn. It's more the fact that Gukesh, clearly having played so quickly, has seen this exact position and has set up for this very relatively nuanced idea of g4, and very likely has seen this position and has evidently planned for all eventualities with this bishop. And this is the critical move. Black could win a pawn. White's very likely come prepared. And Ding at this point spent a few more minutes and played... Gukesh spent a couple of minutes even and played bishop f4. Firstly, if bishop takes b3, then there follows knight d2, and after bishop c4, knight takes on c4, d takes of course, and just a simple move e3, connecting pawns, opening up for the bishop. White will win the pawn on c4. Feel free to pause the video if you'd like to see why black cannot play b5. And well, the answer is of course knight takes b5, because if captures the very sneaky move with the bishop pair, winning the exchange, and this is curtains for black complete winning. The rook will drop, the a7 pawn will drop, and everything will drop. As a result, if you then lose c4, well, you have an open position with two central pawns for white. White's definitely hugely preferable, and Gukesh would have been very happy to have this, and this is very likely why he was going in for it. And that's why it's a little bit risky that Ding has gone in for this very committal bishop c2. It's firmly in white's territory and could well, as we'll see, risk being trapped. There's a lot of pawns around and just a lot of white pieces that will be surrounding the bishop. For that reason, well, pawn h5 was the next move by Ding. Very logical move. If this if this pawn can move forwards, then this bishop will have a lot of, or at least the extra f5 square, possibly even more. And that will make it quite okay position for black. Therefore, rook g1, closing down any potential trades of this file and keeping and maintaining this pawn on g4, very critical. Then saw captures, and it was mentioned both by commentators at the time and in the press conference that a game between Arjun Erigaisi and Vladimir Kramnik from August of 2023 had seen this exact position where after, I believe it was bishop takes on b3, there followed knight d2, bishop c4, and the game continued. Knight takes, d takes, and we see a very similar position to what we just saw, just with the removal of the h-pawns. And the game was a draw, but white's having all the fun here. Kramnik was held to a draw, as I said, but, well, not very fun for black. For that reason, the improvement, as Ding then found, is knight b d7. And it's worth noting that Ding had 90 minutes, and then he had 54 minutes. He used quite a bit of time, over half an hour on this move, but he found the best move. And this is very good because now there's no bishop e5 pins on the f6 knight, and now it does mean that bishop takes b3 becomes an increasing possibility. And it was pointed out that because Ding had found this very critical move defending the knight, attacking e5 and so on and so forth, well, Gukesh now spent, I believe, 10 minutes, yes, 13 minutes, on knight d2, very likely knowing that this was the best move, possibly dealing with some disappointment that Ding had found the right move. And, well, now all of a sudden, these doubled pawns can be a bit risky, but there's definite counterplay, and all the while this bishop is still a persistent issue. And once again, there is no increment in this event, and on move 14, so 26 moves to go until the extra time at move 40, Ding has 54 minutes. As we'll see, rook g8 was played very quickly, showing that the time he'd spent had at least been very worthwhile. The reason for this is, firstly, the h-file isn't really doing anything. Secondly, g5 is a critical idea. If they can achieve this, then the bishop will have a safe haven on g6, possibly even h7 if need be. For that reason, g5 was played, but the downside, of course, as we mentioned earlier, both these squares are a little bit weak. The knight did go to h5, the bishop did retreat to h2, not wanting to give itself up on g3, for example. And rook back to h8, so all played very quickly by Ding within a few minutes, or even a few seconds, and Gukesh has had to start thinking, so the opening's been left, and at this moment, well, on the one hand, black still needs to perhaps fully develop, but then white is not exactly developed either. They do have the bishop pair, and this bishop is still a persistent problem. However, it's anybody's game. Let's see what happened. After f3, well, Ding retreated very cagely, opening up an attack. Therefore, bishop g3 was tried. Hoping to retreat back, potentially defend d4, getting e4 in. White still got a quite pleasant position. Black might well have objectively equalized. However, it's still a very tricky position. And once again, 31 minutes for 22 moves at this point. And as we'll see, that time was an increasing problem in this game. Rook h5. Now, this does attack a pawn. However, because of the move e4, which Gukesh played within 15 minutes of thinking, of course he is sacrificing a pawn. So thinking about it makes a lot of sense just to make sure. But if rook takes on this square, then after rook c1, where is that bishop going? The answer is nowhere. That bishop is going to be dropping at this moment. There's definitely some sacrificial ideas to win as many pawns as possible, but ultimately, as we'll see in the game, if that bishop drops for a pawn or two, it will not be enough. For that reason, Ding captured, the pawn captured back, but now this rook is a little bit sore on this square. It could be attacked by a bishop, and generally it's not really ever threatening to take on g5 in any meaningful way, with various issues of bishop h4 in the long run, and also just being a bit of a target. Meanwhile, therefore, knight e6 was played, trying to target this. However, as we'll see, after rook c1, Ding later said in the press conference that knight takes d4 is what he had seen. But after bishop f2, bishop c5 or g7, I believe g7 was chosen, there followed a move that Ding, all the way back on move 18 of rook h5, had just missed. And that is knight to e2. The reason this is so powerful is, firstly, there is no fork, which would also be mate, if not for knight takes f3, with the bishop helping out on d1. But this destabilizes the knight on d4, and if that knight goes, since this knight simply cannot defend, for example, if knight takes e2, then bishop takes, you're on the rook, everything is hanging, the bishop's hanging, perhaps the best move would be bishop d3, just trying to distract, and you can simply capture this. You could capture the rook, but they win your bishop, so it's not as good, and with black having the bishop pair, b2 is weak, 3 versus 2, and although doubled pawns can be very good at stopping enemy passed pawns, they're still very immobile and vulnerable. For that reason, white can win the bishop and be comfortably ahead. As a result, it's going very pear-shaped for Ding Liren at this moment. Having missed knight e2 from afar, suddenly he has to try and win as many pawns for that bishop, which is now pretty terminally trapped. So after knight takes b3, rook takes c2 even, not capturing this because then the bishop would escape, and black has 1 pawn and not lost the piece. They're now equal on pieces and 2 pawns up. So of course, instead of that, this drops, and after knight takes d2, king takes d2, very, very effective. Yes, the king often, it's said, is not wanting to be in the center, but in an endgame, kings need to pull their weight. And this king defending the center, defending squares, as we will see, could become very, very relevant. Certainly, staying in the middle makes a ton of sense, compared to, say, rook takes d2, where knight e5, and there's a bit of a family fork going on here, where, yes, everything would be dropping in such scenarios. Rook g3 could defend, but then after knight e5, we'll put this on the board, rook g3. Can you find the very good move for black that would use this fork even more so? Theme of distraction. Feel free to pause the video, but of course the answer is rook takes g5, reasoning that if you take back, which is the best move by white, black simply checks, the king moves, and the rook is collected for free. We, of course, gave our rook up for free, so it's essentially a trade, but we won a pawn in the process. Unlike the game, this position, with 5 versus 2, and activity for black's pieces, this is far from trivial and would probably be a draw with best play. Gives extreme drawing chances. If we back up to the game, king takes d2 avoids all of that, and after knight to e5, knight to d4, very accurately calculated, and it's worth noting, having spent 10 minutes on this move, Gukesh right now having a huge time advantage, 43 minutes versus 19, suddenly starts using their time very effectively. Whereas Ding Liren, let's see what happens. He may well be the man out of time. After rook d8, well, good pin, but the bishop is on a7 in a lot of positions, and black is simply an entire piece down, albeit for 2 pawns, but pieces often will beat 2 or 3 pawns, even if technically it's worth 3 points. For example, in a scenario where there's 3 pawns, pieces are so much faster and can win games. After king e2, unpinning and also just avoiding any nasty family forks again. Therefore, rook h2, trying to activate the rook, but after bishop g2 blocking the rook, bishop g3 will evict the rook from the post on h2. As we will see, that's exactly what happened in a few moves. Liren tries to push the pawn to a6 just to make another target. Very tricky move, just forcing white to show what are you doing. And after b3, another kind of prophylactic move, defending some squares, getting it off of a target, very useful move. There followed rook d7, another relatively useful move, just shuffling around. But nonetheless, it does not move the needle on this position. Black is a piece down, and after rook back to c1, connecting their rooks, Gukesh centralizes their pieces, puts it on open file, defends d4 once again, having defended against the c4 square for the knight. We can now reroute, as Gukesh did, the rook to d1. And 6 minutes for Ding Liren for 9 moves. Meanwhile, Gukesh, of course, has tripled the time there. And, well, let's see what happens. 5 minutes spent on king e8. It was at this moment that Ding Liren really struggled to find moves, and it's very understandable. What can Ding play? If they move their rook backwards, then the bishop just comes forwards, and after perhaps the rook retreats, the knight comes to f3, and the more trades that happen, the more likely Gukesh is simply going to have a bishop and 3 pawns versus nothing and 5 pawns, and that will very likely be a technical win in the future. This forces trades off, and if the more trades that happen, very likely the higher the win chance gets for Gukesh. It was in the area of 80% by the Lila Zero computer that was analyzing the position in the live stream. In any case, this did not happen, and after king e8, more importantly, under 2 minutes, fought 9 moves. That's under 20 seconds per move. And that's not very good, because if you can barely make the moves in time, you, of course, thinking about the moves, they're not going to be too good. Let's see what happens. Bishop g3, very attacking move. Ding played the move with 1 second. Rook h5, that was encouraging to see. He might well make it. Let's see what happens. Knight back to f3. Noticeably, Gukesh very sensibly didn't blitz back. He spent 3 minutes on knight f3. If in these scenarios you do blitz back, then the problem is you yourself don't have much time, because you're playing as if you only have the 2-minute time constraints that Ding Liren had. So playing very sensible chess, just thinking through, not changing the position in any unfavorable way, forcing trades and just making safe moves, because if everything trades off, white wins. And as we'll see, after knight takes f3, king takes even f3, walking the king up as we're seeing, a lovely active king. Ding tried to attack the rook, and then the rook simply moved, putting the question to this rook. Well, of course, trading does not feel too good, but Ding had 60 seconds, give or take, and after rook takes on g5, spending a whole minute on it, just frozen in place, not knowing exactly what to do, mainly because of various issues to do with king safety and piece safety, and everything's collapsing. The space is being controlled in a lot of positions, and after bishop h3, hitting the rook, Ding, in 4 seconds, shot forward with f5. There's now 4 moves to make in 5 seconds. That's not that long, and indeed, after bishop f4, rook h5 was technically the last move. It was not played in time, and as you can see, Ding Liren lost on time. He was the man out of time in this game. And really shows that the lack of increment is hugely consequential in this match. Both players have now had their fair share of time issues, put it that way. Of course, Gukesh in round 1 managed to make it with 1 second left to move 40. Well, in this position, very likely an indictment of how tricky and losing it was objectively for Ding. Simply could not make move 40. With 3 moves left to make, he lost on time. And, well, it evened the score, of course. It is now 1.5 each. There is a rest day tomorrow. And it remains to be seen. Very good win. Very good preparation, in fact, for Gukesh. Just what he needed going into the rest day. Equalizing the score in a very, very interesting strategical battle from an otherwise innocuous position. We're seeing a lot of positions in this World Championship match where after Queen c2 and capturing on d5 in the opening, it was not exactly the critical lines, trading off in the center, simplifying things, getting to a position that was a little bit offbeat, not the sort of position Ding Liren with black would have been preparing. Whereas, of course, Gukesh had seen this position, as he clarified in the press conference, with computer help prior for months and months, very likely. And from here, the bishop on c2 was the curious moment for Ding Liren, where it's not necessarily it's a bad move, but it leads to a lot of complex play where actually, as we will see, capturing on b3 only happens many, many moves later at the cost of the bishop ultimately. And so this was definitely a key moment that led to very precarious decisions having to be made by Ding Liren. And just a few moves later, he earned himself the best moves by playing for this plan. The time he spent here was good, but unfortunately that very time he spent here cost him the game ultimately when he ended up flagging at this moment later on, having lost a bishop and playing rook h5. Back once again, that's 3 times it's gone to h5, and once again playing h5 with the rook lost him the game, having lost on time. Well, very interesting fight, evening the scores. Let's see what happens after the rest day. Stay tuned for more. Hope you enjoyed that. And don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. All the best. Cheers.